Good morning, everybody. I asked if I could stand instead of sitting. I always like to have contact with the public where I'm presenting with, and I think that's better if I stand. I'm a cultural economist by training, so this will be a more theoretical presentation. And I hope you have questions afterwards. And to get that further, stuck in the middle, how framing creative craft helps to enhance the sector. Let me first introduce where this comes from. It's part of my PhD research, and I'm interested to know what helps valuing creative crafts. And that comes from the fact that we enjoy bakeries for their bread. We enjoy nurses for their practical work in hospitals, and the same goes for goldsmiths. But in the Netherlands, we feel that they're not appreciated. And that's the reason why I was able to do this research and wanted to do this research, because it's a very complex world, the creative crafts world. It's very versatile, and it seems to be situated between design and art. That's often where we put creative crafts within. But the tensions that exist because of the different policy making around the three fields raise questions regarding the design and the suitability of these regulations. A thorough debate or understanding of the concept of creative crafts, the field cannot occupy a significant position within society and economy. So that's the reason why my first chapter is on what is creative craft, where does it position it, and what does that mean. The outline will be the notion of creative craft, because as you can see, we have a lot of notions. We have a lot of definition when it comes to creative crafts. And that bricolage is wonderful, but it can also hamper the sector. I want to discuss the foundation for creative skilled work, since I think it's more about manual dexterity, or what is called, the technical part or the handwork. I want to talk about the status of creative craft, what it means in practice. As some of you know, I'm a goldsmith, so I have the privilege of being educated and going through all the stages from being educated as a practical person and now doing my PhD. And finally, the conclusions and the reflections. The notion of creative craft, and this is interesting, it came across more often these days. Also here we find sometimes the language barrier, but it helps of us understanding the position of crafts and where it comes from. Because in Latin it means ars, referring to art. In Greek it has a relation to technique. In English, craft means experience, skill, and handwork. And when it comes to handwork, it has more a connotation, a relation to the German craft, which is often referred as handwork. And having said that, it is a term that describes specific trades doing manual work, but in France, artisanat, as I learned it, but maybe you can help me there. It's derived from the Latin word ars, and it's used nowadays for artisanry, but also initially more extensive. It means including skill, virtuosity, science, trade, and craftsmanship and artifice. You will notice that I don't use the word craftsmanship, because I think artisanship is more general than craftsmanship. So I try, and because it's creative work, I relate to artisanship. So using the notion of craft in and outside language borders is complicated, and it demonstrates the complexity of framing the term of creative craft. However, in addition to the general connotation regarding skilled manual work, its relation to trade and art remains unclear. So I'd like to go with you to the relation to creative skilled work. Luckman and Thomas wrote a book on creative economies, and they deliberately did that, called it economies, again because of the diversity of the field. In 2013, the Ministry of Sports in Sports and Culture in England decided that they wanted to skip crafts out of their funding system because it said it was too little to research. It was too small. So at that time, the craftsmen raised up, the Crafts Council raised up, and they put it on the agenda again. So what you might see there is because of that, in England there is a rather awareness regarding crafts, but it signals not only the multiplicity of the craft itself, but also the complexity of its relations within the economic field, including its freight status and its creative industry. And when I started my PhD 4 years ago, I thought I'd like to know what was the reason why people valued craft. I ended up finding it more interesting to know what the relationships are, what the actors are that help enhance, that help vitalize a creative craft sector. So, as I said, I'm a cultural economist, and the UNCTAD made in 2010 an extensive list of how they see the creative industries, the creative cultural industries. They divided in four large categories: heritage, arts, media, and functional creations, and a few subcategories. As you can see, when you look at crafts, it is placed into heritage as art crafts, and functional creations relating to interior fashion, jewelry, and surprisingly, toys. But the paradox is that mass production is good for economy, and that is what UNCTAD is. It looks at driving the economy, but it threatens values and local production and identity. So UNCTAD, in its report, it describes 211 different cultural creative industries. And what you see is that art crafts is described as the soul of all cultural and creative industries, and the basis for other categories mentioned in the report. Art craft represents cultural sites and national cultural expressions. In the Netherlands, that for example mean these kind of cultural festivities regarding flowers, but also tapestry. I read this somewhat as craft is either has a connotation to the past or is related to the present as design. And I think there's a lot in between those worlds. For example, Klamer et al. Uses the notion of manual dexterity to divide different craft disciplines. I get to that further because first I'd like to explore the term creative. What does creativity mean? In the early days, it was seen as a genius working in the service of God. That was what creativity was related to. Sennett, I think a lot of you read the book from Sennett, which the title I now forget. That's always nice, isn't it? Sorry?
What is the hand?
What knows your hand?
What knows your hand? Maybe that's translated from French. I think it's, yeah. But anyways, at least we know the work. But he tries to avoid it a bit in his work, because he rather speaks of the intuitive nature of crafts, whereas Emma Bell, when she looks to art, talks about artistic expression and the inspiration where creative craft is related to. But if you look at it from a cultural economic perspective, then creativity is seen, and we've seen that yesterday also in presentations, as a tool for new practices, for innovation, for experiences. So the term creativity has very different connotations, and it can be defined in many ways. For example, as I said, I'm a goldsmith, and as such, I use a torch and other tools to make jewelry. The pieces I create have my signature. They embody their creativity because they reflect my aesthetic aspirations. However, as a goldsmith, I can also specialize in restoration. Obviously, a restorer is creative in finding solutions to return an antique jewelry piece into its original state. However, while using the same tools, materials and skill, this kind of inventive solutions-orientated thinking is often considered to be a different interpretation of the notion of creativity, as the expression shown in my goldsmith work. The creativity of a restoration goldsmith is bound by the design, material properties and artisanship of the initial maker of the piece. These three features determine the ingenuity and skills required to restore original jewelry pieces. However, the restoration goldsmith will not add decorative creativity to the original. As for example, Fabergé did. How can I forget Fabergé? And I already mentioned the economy, the catalyst for economic and technical change. And often creativity is also seen as an individual process. Whereas in the economy we say that it is only been seen as a form of genius work when peers within that sector perceive it to be as such. Meaning, in other words, it's not an individual process, it's a social process. It's a process that we do in a certain context with other people. And that's a red thread throughout my whole research. If we look at the model that Kramer et al. Produced, we can see that it's very helpful because they differentiate between different crafts. If I read this model, they put contemporary crafts in the middle, cutting-edge craft, combining design, arts, and contemporary crafts, whereas handwork almost stands out of the center of that model. If we look at craft, what distinguishes craft from design and arts is often the technique, but also the functionality. A hat needs to be worn, a cup needs to be drinked out, and jewelry also needs to be worn. So it's that functionality that distinguishes it from art and from design. And design is more often a tool to sell, and art is more often a tool to express. So while this is a very helpful model to work with, I would at the end see it differently. Because the focus on this tripart arrangement suggests that the relationship between designers, art and creative crafts forms the base for the enhancement of creative craft proficiency. When reading the model from left to right, there appears to be a hierarchy among the crafts forms presented in the report. Moreover, like I said, handwork is presented outside the framework. I would rather say that the notion should be presented in the middle. In the middle of the context of creative, or the context of craft. Skilled handwork is basis for creative craft as well as traditional craft, restoration craft, which we could maybe more see as heritage craft practices, whereas creative, repair and utilitarian craft could be contemporary craft practices, especially because utilitarian craft with sustainability, climate change is a way to get forward. Having said that, if we look at the status of creative craft, what does that mean? The research of Neither, she looked at ceramics in Israel, and she found, where the same as Rijk did for Droog Design, which is a famous Dutch collective, that craftsmanship was somewhat borrowed. It was borrowed as a strategy to sell the design and the relationship to sell products, whereas the relationship between the designer and the craftsman or craftsperson was asymmetric, meaning that the designer got all the credits, whereas the craftsperson was not seen, hardly seen. So that's complicated. Next to that, the expertise regarding the materiality and the process is lacking. There were no experts who had enough knowledge of what it means to be a craftsperson, what it means to work with materials, material dexterity. What does that mean? They could look at it from an historian perspective. They could look at it from a designer perspective, but not from a craft perspective. Because that knowledge is embodied in the good. I did research with consumers. They say they value craftsmanship, whereas on the other hand, they don't know what craftsmanship is. So that makes it a very complicated paradox. Next to that, material dexterity is essential to explore new grounds. Kuipers, who is a Dutch archaeologist, puts forward that it's a way to be innovative. It's a way, it's a tool that could be used to get further. And therefore it needs to have a body of its own. It needs a context of its own. But then, is that a triptych affair? Is it a tripartite affair? Is it only design, art and craft? I would say it's not. As Greiner and Polper say, at least technology and industry are also part of crafts and also part of creative crafts. When I worked as a goldsmith, I partnered up with an excellent hand engraver. He did all the engraving in all my work, in the wedding rings, everything that I produced. I had an excellent German setter who set all my stones. It's a specialized craft job. And also I, for example, used a specialized filigree craftsman to restore my work. So there's a lot of technology and industry involved in crafts. It's not only the art and the design. For that reason, I would propose a different context for creative craft. I would say it's broader than that. And as such, it also has much more influence. It's not design, it's not only art, it's also the industry and it's also technique. That brings me to my conclusion. What does that mean? It seems that skilled handwork is the foundation for creative craft practices. And it's central to all craft making, including other contemporary craft practices. That the current perspective on the framework of creative craft next to design also includes different practices as industry and technique, and that the expertise on the process of making of creative craft products appears to be lacking, and that has great implications for the industry. Therefore, I think it's important to look at the ecosystematic context of creative crafts and the nature of embodied goods. Thank you for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, so thank you for this presentation. So now it's time to the questions. So if everyone have a question, yes.
Thank you very much. Absolutely different perspective, as you said. It was really very interesting to get to know what your research is about, and thank you for that, because I find it very interesting. And my question is more about your predictions, because you are craftsman, at the same time you're a researcher, you follow the trends, you know how important is this trend of handwork and crafts in the global world, I would say now, how important it is for designers who are so fascinated with this. And what are your predictions? How far can we go with this? I mean, how long it will be a trend? Because what I observed is a different perspectives now, and we can say that craft is also a kind of a reflection that we need according to the globalization processes, and you are in deep research of so-called the nature of creative crafts. Should we go that way in the future? Is there any future for traditional crafts? And how long do you think it will be kind of trend for design as well? This is not a, I'm just asking about your intuition. This is this kind of question. But thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I know from talking to you that you're interested in cultural heritage. So it's creative craft will always be incorporated in tradition, but tradition evolves. Yesterday's tradition, today's tradition will be tomorrow's practices. But that relates to identity, that relates to local culture. And I forgot to say that this research is based on a Western perspective. There are so many perspectives towards this. And having that in mind, creative crafts or crafts itself will always be part of our lives. But I think the risk lies in acknowledging that it's evolving. Maybe hanging on to yesterday will hamper being prepared for the future. Because as you said, we had several rises and downfalls of crafts. With Morrison during the first period in the 1920s, but also with Bauhaus in Germany in the 70s, where it was used as as an activation for crafts. So yes, we need to. I think it's a very important question to think: how can we make sure that crafts will be part of his life, and what then is the value of that creative craft? What is the addition of creative craft? And I think that's multiple. I think, and that's something that I learned when we were in Sweden, and I looked then at Pauline when we were at BIX. For example, knowing how things work makes you aware also regarding sustainability, where material comes from, how it's been used. And it's also a different way of thinking, making you more innovative. And I think we have to be more aware of those features than only the decorative or the historical function, if that's an answer to your question. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You said really briefly that the consumer values the craft, but they don't really know what it is. I just wanted to come back to this concept really quickly. Do you think that there is then a mystic or dreamy vision of craft? And if yes, does it serve the craft, or do we need to try and explain the craft to the consumers? What do you think?
Yeah. Thank you for your question, because it's difficult, isn't it? How can they value it? For my PhD, which is a comparative research, I compare the Netherlands with Germany, and I've interviewed experts in both countries, and I've interviewed visitors in both countries. For visitors of a jewelry craft fair in a museum and a special venue. And when I asked the experts in Germany how they thought that the visitors would rate the appreciation for the goldsmith craft in their country, they gave it a 5.6. It was only 6 interviewees, so it's just one. Whereas the Dutch mentioned the 7.2, and when I asked the visitors themselves, the Dutch said an 8.2. And the German a 7.3. So the first things is that there apparently is a difference in how we as experts perceive that appreciation. And then this appreciation is a number. My 5 could be far worse than your 5. So I also looked at what did they value, what were the reasons why they value things. And then in the Netherlands, craftsmanship come up very often. Whereas the expert also mentioned, but I don't have the idea that they know what craftsmanship is. Then coming back to your suggestion, it was also mentioned that we should learn, it helps craftspeople to be aware that they also, it's one of the experts said it very nice. He said it's a noblesse oblige, meaning if you are able to do this wonderful work as a craftsman, it also has obligations. If you want craft to thrive, you're part of the solution. You're part of that context. You need to be part of that community. But that also means something for education. That might also mean that we should look at how can we incorporate communal thinking within our practices as educators. Meaning, you have to. It might be good to discuss with students. What do you think of each other's work? What is your contribution? Not only your work, it's nice that you do. I said yesterday in your economics you have a term art for art's sake, meaning artists love what they do. They don't mind having side jobs, they don't mind being poor, they just want to make art. Often the same goes for craft. You also have craft for craft's sake. But that also means that if you're not thinking about what is your role within crafts, what do you bring for society? Or what does your work bring for your society? If we don't ask our students those questions, well, let's put it positively. I think it would help if we ask our students those questions to make them aware and to make them part of the solution. Is that a question? Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much.
You spoke about noblesse oblige on craft, and you spoke about asymmetric relationships between designer and craft people. And how is your analysis on these relationships in the future and this influence on the value of work of craft people?
Yeah, I think it's obvious if you, as a society, and if the government is a representative of that society, if we feel as society that craft, handwork is important, then we also need policies and we also need funding schemes, right funding schemes to do justice on that valuation. So that means that you have to have accessible funding programs for craft people. They often are not educated, to go for calls, to know how to have funding applications. So you have to rethink how you can make that accessible. And maybe, again, not look at individual funding, but maybe communal funding. Look at branch organizations to fund that. And that's very practical. What you also see, I think, and that's also what Nieser sees that, and I see that at art schools, is that you also see a turnaround that designers tend to like to know more about what craft is. So that, again, it's about knowledge and sharing, and that often starts with education, but also has a very, I think, important role for branch organizations, for crafts councils, for other organizations to acknowledge that. And how I see that future, well, I think what's promising is that there is acknowledgement for the fact that how important crafts is. I see that by the numerous European funding which is there, but the question at the end is how can we proceed that? So it would be a pity if then suddenly that stops. So I think one of the things that we have to be aware when we work on those projects is how can we make the results of those projects so sustained that it also has an independent part for the future. Because one of the things that is hampering what I mentioned earlier in Britain, but it's in every country, they're all small, singular persons. It is a complicated task that we ask from them. Not only be, an expert in the handwork you do, excellent, but also selling it. I know that we have a brilliant presentation on that today or tomorrow, I think, on business entrepreneurship. To get back to conclude, I think that having thinking in a broader way of how we can help them, how we can help the craft sector, will help them at the end to build certain policies to enhance it. I think that might be one of the ways. Sorry for the long answer.
So thank you very much for your presentation. We can listen to you during many hours. It's fascinating. So yes, I have a question, because you have an experience like a practitioner as goldsmith, and many craft person have a multiplicity of activity. So sometimes there is an activity for traditional crafts, maybe another one about creative crafts, and yes, how they can interact together. Maybe the traditional craft activity can give many ways in creative crafts. And yes, I would like to question you about that.
How that can be, if I understand your question correctly, how that cooperation can be strengthened. I think they're all very good research questions, aren't they? It sounds maybe a bit contrary to what I presented here, because I tend to get them out as different craft disciplines. For the sake of clarity and for the sake of policy making, I think that's important. Whereas those regulations should, at the end, be more stirred towards cooperation, also within the different disciplines. And I think even within one discipline, it will be a challenge to find them. And I think one of the ways in the Netherlands we just started the government of culture and education. We had a round table 2 years ago to have an inventory on what would be the next step. And what you see is that then a new program is aiming to start, and it's on the individual craft person. And I think you might here too. See how you could strengthen brands organizations, guilds, help them also through research to get new perspectives to help them to thrive, to help them combine and make those bridges and help craftspeople to see what can be gained with the spare time that they have. I think they also have to make choices. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah.
You said about the traditions, how they are changing within the time, and I totally agree with that. And how could you comment the crafts, the traditional crafts, in order to preserve the cultural heritage, because the traditional crafts are changing. How will we keep and preserve the cultural heritage in this case?
I think involve young professionals. If we want to have a solution for tomorrow's cultural heritage, also crafts, I think we have to involve young professionals in the research that we do, and look for ways to connect future needs to what's traditionally there. And it's getting more and more challenging because of, and therefore I'm also very interested in the AI discussion, but also sustainability. And I think if we are able to connect those challenges to what traditional crafts have to offer regarding identity, because it is it's it is a common good. Cultural heritage, we could see that, we could perceive that as a common good, meaning it's from all of us, like the water we drink. And if that's the case, then we should look at how could that cultural identity help us to be sustained for the future. And I think incorporating the knowledge of young professionals helps to get a clearer perspective of that. Does that help? Is that helpful? Or not? Is that... Yeah.
Thank you very much for the very deep reflections on that. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate just a little bit more about this ecosystem approach, because it does seem really complex. So where do you start when looking at ecosystem? Maybe what are the boundaries, or what are your reflections about the ecosystem approach when mapping crafts?
I think you also saw that I deliberately choose to say ecosymmetric context and not an ecosystem, because I think it's a different approach, it's a different notion, because it's not something that evolves that naturally, like a biological ecosystem. We have a lot of influence in that. We don't know what the result is, but we have a lot of influence regarding that. And for me, the context, but it's a good question, because I have to challenge that myself on that, and you help. I have to challenge myself on that question still, and you help me with that. Because I think the first thing I would do is look at a country. But that maybe has to do with the fact that I compare two countries. If you look at the German ecosystem, if we would call it that, they have a very well-structured ecosystem, which goes from upwards to down. Everything is very well organized, from the central level at the government, through state level, through guilds, and the guilds organize education. Whereas in the Netherlands, that's been broken down. In 2012, we've broken down that system. And I expected that that would result in a less appreciation, which it doesn't. But getting back to your question, I think I would maybe go to, in my research, would go to, it would make sense to look at a country. But having said that, it obviously goes beyond. But I look at it from a Western perspective. That context goes worldwide. So I think it depends on what the aim, what you would like to how you would use ecosystem in your research to depend that context. That's, I think, what my answer so far would be. But thank you for asking it.
Can come also from the top down. We can consider an ecosystem of one craft person that has around its own policy making and other stakeholders. So, I was interested in your approach.
Yeah.
More top down,
Yeah, or you could look at just, for example, now only goldsmithing, and instead of creative craft. I think that would be helpful to look at one field. Since it is already complex in its own. So I think that would be one choice that I would make, and then disperse that context within a country, because it has the most influence. A lot of craft is still very local. So therefore I think I would not choose so often to go beyond a country as an ecosystem. Thank you for the question.